Shalom and welcome to the 2017 Homeschool Family Conference. And in this session, we're going to be talking about how to teach the fine arts, music, art, and literature especially. And we're going to give you some basic principles to determine when is it right to use something and when is it wrong to use something. So we're going to dig right in. My name is Ann Elliott, and I'm the creator and founder of homeschoolingtorah.com. Teaching fine arts is required in many states in the United States, and this summer one of the things that we did was go back through the requirements for every single state and to actually make sure that our curriculum at Homeschooling Torah fulfilled every requirement. We did this when we first started, but we wanted to just go back through because a lot of things have changed over 4 years. And one of the things that I felt that we were weak in, and I think we've always known we were a little weak in, was the literature. And as well as music and art. We do offer music and we do offer art, but I didn't know if it would fit maybe a high school standard. So we've been busy this summer beefing up the curriculum. We're going to be opening up some clubs for our high school students, and that is going to start in September, where the students can interact with each other and do some of the activities that we're going to talk about in this session. But if you're not a member of Homeschooling Torah, or you are a member and your kids are not able to participate in those clubs, or you just are wanting to do something different, we wanted to give you some guidelines from the book, because that's our theme of our conference this year, Guiding Our Lives by the Book, so that you would be able to evaluate the fine arts in our world and also know that you're fulfilling the requirements of the law. So, it's not necessary to purchase a lot of curriculum in order to do this. This is something that you can do at home, and it will fulfill, just like everything we've been talking this week, Deuteronomy chapter 6, where you talk with your kids and discuss as you go throughout your day, as you sit, as you walk, as you lie down, as you stand. So, I'm going to start in, I'm going to go through each category and just give you some overarching principles. And then in our handout and on below the video here on our website, we have a lot of links, tons of links, because I can't cover everything in this short video. So we're going to try to send you to tons of reading materials on the internet, all of which are free. A couple books I think I have recommended too. If they made it to my recommendation list, I've been reviewing hundreds of books this summer, and if they made it to this list, it's because I really think they were the most helpful of everything that I found. Okay, so let's start out. First of all, I'm going to start, even though it says teaching music, art, and literature, I'm going to go backwards. I wish I had thought of that when I made the title up weeks ago, but I'm going to start with literature, and then we're going to talk about music and art. First of all, is it even biblical to teach literature outside of the Bible? Because obviously the Bible is a piece of literature, and it's the one that we base all of our textbooks on and everything that we teach our kids. So is it biblical to be adding in a whole bunch of books that are filled with humanistic theories and ways of looking at things? Or even maybe they're Christian authors and they don't understand the Torah, or maybe they're Jewish authors and they don't see Yeshua as the Messiah. Is it biblical to have our kids read these things? Well, I have an article posted below the video for you, and this was the one I would recommend that you start with, and it's called Plundering the Egyptians, and I cannot remember the author's name, but it's at the bottom of the article. And in this author, this gentleman goes through all of the places in the apostolic scriptures where the apostles quoted what we would consider classic works of literature, most of them were Greek, all of them were pagan, all of them, some of them were maybe noble ideas, but from a humanistic perspective, and yet not one time did the apostles ever list these works of literature as a bad thing. It is obvious that these men had studied literature, probably in their Jewish schools and synagogues. I know that the Apostle Paul studied under famous Rabbi Gamaliel, and so it is interesting to me that they studied these things. And these are some of the things that I have not allowed my kids to study because I didn't want them to be involved in studying idolatry or pagan things. I'm not saying that you have to have your kids study these things, but it is interesting that the apostles did and were able to take principles, good things from that literature. Basically what the author is saying is that just as the Israelites plundered the Egyptians the night that they left Egypt after the 10th plague, before they crossed the Red Sea, the night of Passover, that they asked all of their Egyptian neighbors to give them of their gold and silver and valuable things, and then they plundered the Egyptians. And basically this author is making the comparison that we can take the good things of the world and turn them into something beautiful as long as we do it based on Torah principles. Now, I think there are some cautions as we do this. First of all, the book of Deuteronomy is incredibly clear that we are not to learn the ways of the nations around us. How do we go about doing that when we have to live in a culture? We have to be involved in our society. We have to have some commonality with the people around us so that we can carry on conversations with the nations. And I'm not saying that just because something was done in the first century was it entirely based on the Torah. There were a lot of things that happened in first century Judaism that are not based on Torah. Yeshua makes that very clear in the book of Matthew, for instance, as he evaluates the culture around him, and he explains how to do culture in a Torah observant way. That's how I view the book of Matthew. One of the things that he notes in that is that we are not to add men's traditions to the Torah. So I don't think you should be going out and reading any works of literature if you are not familiar with the Torah. So that makes Torah reading, copy work, writing it, talking it, discussing it, applying it to your life the highest priority in your school day. I don't care what state requirements say. If you have not studied the Torah, if you do not know your Bible, then you better stay away from other things because you have no comparison. You will not know if it's right or wrong. And it's interesting to me how many people say they don't have time to read the Bible, but they have time to read all kinds of other things, including news sources. And boy, that's a work of literature that is filled with fake news. It's very difficult to evaluate what is true and what is not true. So if you do not have time for the scriptures, you don't have time for anything else. So I just want to make that incredibly clear. As we plunder the Egyptians, though, as we take works that are written by mankind, and I have books that I ask you to read. I've been recommending my books all week. I'm just a work of literature. And you have to evaluate the things that I say on this video, in books of literature, in anything that I do, and you have to compare it to the scriptures. In the book of Acts, the Thessalonians were not as noble as those from Berea because they did not compare to the scriptures. And the scriptures, of course, if you think about it just a second, the only copy of the scriptures they had available was the Torah scroll that would have been in their local synagogue. So they were going to the synagogue, opening up the Torah scroll and comparing what Paul said to that Torah scroll. And that's what we have to do too. That's considered a noble thing. Probably it's the word noble. It's considered a rich thing to be able to have access to those works of literature, including a Torah scroll, which was very expensive and quite rare, especially once you got out of the land of Judea. So we are so rich. We have access to the internet, which is a richness that no other culture has ever had before. But with that richness comes a huge responsibility to know the scriptures first and foremost and know them better than anything else, so that like the Bereans, we are constantly comparing. You hold up one thing and you hold up the other and you go and compare. And if there is something false over here that does not line up with the Word of God, then it must be thrown out. Whether it's science, whether it's history, whether it's literature, no matter what it is, we have to be willing, even if it's unpopular, to throw out anything that does not line up. All right, kinds of fiction or kinds of literature. You have fiction, you have nonfiction. I think our kids should be doing both. In the nonfiction category, I think we should be having our children read modern day nonfiction, but even more so reading nonfiction from the centuries previous, all the way back as far as you can find it on the internet. Yes, it's more difficult. Yes, you're reading a translation of the original. Maybe if your kids are geniuses and you have lots of time, you can read the originals in their original language. But for me, it has been amazing. You can find an old book online, and you can, a lot of times they're in text format, and you can copy paste them, put them into Google Translate, and you can read anything in Latin or Greek all the way into our English language. It's just amazing the resources that we have. So have your kids read it. It's difficult, yes, but it will really, really build their abilities. One of the most important pieces of literature that you can have your kids start with is the King James Version of the Bible. I know a lot of you are groaning, no, I hate the King James, but there is so much value in having your kids learn from the King James Version, because they are learning to take something that was written down, translated would be a better word, almost, 400, how many years ago, early 1600s, 400 years ago, in a way of speaking and thinking in a culture that was very different from ours, and learning to translate that in their minds to the way they think and talk today. It's the same time period as Shakespeare. I don't personally let my kids read too much Shakespeare, hardly any at all. And I know that may sound crazy to you, but I consider most of it just very, very bad, filled with pornography and all kinds of things that I don't want my kids to learn about. Although I do, not have a problem with teaching them the titles and maybe the main idea, but that's about as far as we go. I don't need to teach them Shakespeare because the King James Version of the Bible was written in the same time period, and it is filled with good and lovely things. So that's just my personal opinion. Talking about literature, that's one of the ones I don't let my kids do. Philippians 4:8 is a list of the kinds of literature, fiction and nonfiction, that I think we should very much focus on. It needs to be true. It needs to be noble. It needs to be just. Now, let's think about just for a second. You can have a story, maybe a detective story, and in this detective story there's a murder and a crime scene. Yes, that is something evil and against God's commands, but the justice that happens in that story, if it has a just ending and people are brought to justice in a righteous way, I don't have a problem with my kids reading it. Is it pure? Is it lovely? Is it of a good report? In other words, does it lift up or does it discourage? Does it have any virtue? Is it praiseworthy? If so, think or meditate. That's what that word really means, to meditate, mull over, chew on, meditate on these things. And I don't think you can really read much without thinking about it later. Sometimes my kids like to read books, fiction books that are set in an imaginary place where the whole thing is fantasy and it's been a made-up world with made-up fictional characters, made-up animals, made-up everything. Obviously, this is not something that God has created, but my kids go into it knowing that it's made up. Just like, to me, it's very similar to the assignment in our history curriculum where we have the kids make a map of the Garden of Eden. Nobody knows what the Garden of Eden looked like. We make it made up. It's a fantasy world, but it is based on reality. I have found that a lot of fantasy books fill that category. And however, as they meditate and mull over that world that they're thinking about as they read that book, it needs to have those characteristics. Some of the things that it needs to stay away from are things like magic and sorcery, witches and wizards and mediums. Things that you need to be careful of is that the main character is not filled with vengeance and hate. However, those things do show up in books. So what do we do? What do we do about a book that might have some magic in it? I think it's incredibly important to make sure that that magic is portrayed as evil. The scriptures say it is evil, and it must always be in the place of evil. Even so, I hesitate. We have a rule in our house: if there's magic, we don't let them read it. I know there are very famous books that do have magic in them, and most of the time the people that argue for letting their kids read it is as long as the magic is portrayed as evil, as the scriptures portray it. I can see their point. To me, it's a line I don't cross, but each of us are going to have to make our own decisions on this. What about books that are filled with Christmas and Easter or Catholicism? I mean, that describes most of the books of the last few hundred years, because everyone in our culture celebrated those holidays. Everyone was involved in a Catholic or Catholic-like church. And I think one of the values in letting them go ahead and read it is that they need to know what really happened in history. Those things were part of our common collective history for the last almost 2,000 years. And because of that, it's going to be very difficult. You can't just chop out 2,000 years of the world. You can teach your children about these things, but you need to teach it to them in a Torah perspective. This brings up a really important point. When you're doing literature, whether you're just letting your kids go to the library and choose a book from the shelves, or whether you're choosing a book for them, it's really important to discuss. Discussion is the key to literature. If you do not discuss the books that your kids are reading, have a discussion about it, and this would go for TV shows as well. Movies that you might be watching, do it together. Don't just let them go off on their own. They can read a book on their own. You're a mom, you're not going to have time to read like they do. But you need to have a time where you get together and discuss. To me, this doesn't happen unless I schedule it. One of the times, though, that I really enjoy talking about literature that my kids are reading, fiction books especially, that they might choose at the library or download on their Kindle, is when we're driving. To me, I'm driving along, I don't have anything, I can't do anything else at that time. I can have a discussion. I put the kid that's reading a book in the front seat. I intentionally choose, hey, you're going to go with me to the store today. And while we're driving, we talk about, what are you reading? Oh, what are the characters like? Oh, what did they do? Did they do things that were right? And the kids are used to me, so they start to talk and they tell me about the things that are in their books. Romance is something that's going to show up in a lot of your books. And so this is something that's really important because your kids are going to choose lifelong mates. And you need to be constantly having that discussion with them. What kind of a choice did they make? Did they choose someone because of their godly characteristics in their heart, or did they look on the outward appearance? What made them the decision to fall in love? What do you think falling in love is? How did they choose to marry that person? Did they abstain from any physical contact, until they were married, or were they kissing at their first opportunity? Those things can set up a really bad picture in your kid's mind of what love and marriage look like, when love and marriage usually doesn't look anything like that. Again, this is one of those times I like to go back in time and get some of the older literature selections for romantic stories because they seem to have a lot more common sense than our modern ones do. War and death, violence. Those are things that are in the Bible. There's a lot of violence in Scripture, and as your kids study it, you're going to have to talk about what does it mean that God slaughtered 20,000 people because they didn't obey one of his commands? What does it look like for 20,000 people to die? What does it look like in the book of Revelation when it speaks of the times in history when the rivers ran red with blood? That's violent. I would rather my children encountered violence first in Scripture and then with me discussing it with them. So I can talk about the concepts such as bravery, courage, standing up for what is right, giving your life, becoming a martyr. Fox's Book of Martyrs is filled with violence. I can hardly handle most of it. But your kids need to know about some of these things. Not to the point, though, where it becomes not of a good report, where it's dragging our hearts down with discouragement. We need to focus our attention on what things are lovely, but sometimes things in life are also true and just, and that brings in some violence. Senseless violence, though, where people are just filled with hatred and almost an evil spirit. I don't think you should have any part of those kinds of things. So be very cautious in what you do. What about bad language? Sometimes it's important, again, in the context of you discussing and teaching your children, you can encounter some bad language and help your kids understand why that word was used, what it meant in its original context, and why we shouldn't use it, what people would think of us if we were to ever say that word. I think it's much better to teach it and to expose your kids than to just let them hear it in other places. But yeah, generally speaking, we should avoid those things because they're not lovely. I'm trying to think if there's anything. Of course, you're not going to encounter too many people keeping the Sabbath. I don't think we should change history. When we're reading a book and it says they went to church on Sunday and they call it a Sabbath. I know my 9-year-old daughter, she heard recently in a book and it said it was the Sabbath, but it was clearly a Sunday, and her eyes got really big and she said, "Mom, that's not the Sabbath." And see, that's the kind of stuff that I'm glad that I was there with her to have that discussion, so that it wasn't something she had to figure out on her own. She needs to know history. She needs to know what people do, but she needs to be able to compare it to the Torah. So there are a lot of things you can teach discernment. Talk about how is God presented in this. Is there a Messiah figure? Is this an analogy of Yeshua, or is this another culture who doesn't believe in Yeshua, who's raising up their own Messiah figure? Talk about character development. Are the characters strong? Do they have characteristics that you would want to emulate in your life? Are they loving and helpful and kind and true? Are they responsible? Are they hospitable? Are they sensitive to the weak? Or are they self-serving and cruel? It's really, really wonderful to talk about characters. It's also important to talk about the settings that are being discussed in a book. You can travel all over the world in the pages of a book. That's one of my favorite things. I remember reading a book about the Navajo reservation and hearing about its loveliness. It was written from the eyes of a Navajo person, and then Yehovah providentially led our family to move to the Navajo reservation. And all I could think about was, oh, I've been here before. It's just like the book. And, I remember reading about shiprock and just so many things that were just exactly like what it really was like. And yet I'd never been there before. I feel like I've been many places. One of the things that you can do in a book is take your kids on a traveling adventure. And it's very fun while you do a book like that, if your child is doing it on their own or as a family, if you're reading aloud, to make maybe a lap book or a few notebooking pages all about that country and that culture. If it's a fake place, it's still fun. Do those fake places and make, maybe it's a town in the United States that is completely fake, but patterned after real places. It's really fun to try to figure out where it could be, and you can learn so much from those things. Let's see, how did the plot turn out? We can learn about plots. I love to compare plots. There are really only, a handful, maybe 20 basic plots in the world. And I have a book on my shelf about plot development, what those are. And we love to read that book together and identify the plots in the literature and in the movies that we're watching. It's very fun. I like to take them to the scriptures and to see the most beautiful plot of all and try to find those plots in the Bible. They're there. How should we respond to a book that we're reading? Would we recommend it to our grandmother? Would we recommend it to our little sister? Would we recommend it to the teaching elders in our congregation? If we can't answer a yes to that question, then we probably shouldn't be reading it. And another fun thing to do is, what kind of an ending would you write to the book? Would you write a sequel? Have your kids write down maybe a page or two of what they wish would happen after the book ended. That's a fantastically fun thing to do. Find out a little bit about the author, whether it's an author in the 6th century BC, or an author in the 1400s, or an author today living right here in the United States, maybe an author in your state. Find out about the author, go meet authors, go to book signings at Barnes & Noble. Those kinds of things are very helpful to help your children understand that a book is written by a human being. That human being has strengths and weaknesses, and they see the world through their set of glasses. But it's very eye-opening to study literature through the eyes of that specific author. One of the authors that I'm sure I probably know something about, is Jane Austen. She has a character in her book named Anne Elliot, as you probably know. And one of the things that is intriguing to me about Jane Austen is that she had Addison's disease, which is what I have. So it was really fun when I found that out about her, and I could really relate to her because I have Addison's disease. So that's just one example. It is really important. Let's talk about some ways that you can study literature for different age groups. For elementary age, and I don't know how old to take elementary through. Basically, you'll know when your child is not an elementary student anymore because they just turn into a thinking teenager. But basically, 7th and 8th grade, maybe 9th grade, right in there, I'm going to consider everything younger than that as elementary. And during this time, it's really important to survey the books out loud, to discuss them together. And then as you read things, build timelines, study the main characters. I think especially for history, as you study literature, to learn more about history. And we are giving away a book this week, by the way, by Christine Miller, All Through the Ages, and it's a guide to studying history with literature. And I hope one of you wins it. I know, one of you will win it. I hope you enjoy it and love it. It's one of my favorite books. I use it all the time. But as you read those books and study history, or parts of the world, because she talks about that as well, build timelines and write down key facts and key historical people on either 3x5 cards or put them in your timeline book, and then review them to help them stick. I enjoy using 3x5 cards. But if you're using our history curriculum, we also have every week, we have things that you can review. I think it's usually the third or fourth day of every week that here, you need to review these things with your kids. Make sure that they have a framework of history to start putting the things in that they learn, because we learn things very randomly. You might learn something from ancient history and then hop all the way to modern history, and one of the best ways that you can help your kids learn to put it in and have a context for what they learn and actually remember is to have this timeline where you put everything and then to review those things that will help you hold on to it. For instance, in the book of Revelation, learning about the seals and the trumpets and the bowl judgments, so that you will remember where everything fits. That just really made history come alive for me. Learning what the main dates are when Israel was taken off into dispersion and Judah was taken off into dispersion. Learning when the flood was, what year was that? When was Adam and Eve, approximately? Having all of that helps you evaluate so much. So if they're listening to something and it says that 10,000 years ago these hunter-gatherers were discovering something, they'll go, wait a second here, 10,000 years ago is before Adam and Eve, so I know that the person talking doesn't believe in a literal timeline for the scriptures. Okay. Some activities. As you do books, do activities. This will help your children not just read, but also learn to really evaluate things. So have them tell you what they're learning and discuss what you're learning, and then do hands-on projects, do notebooking pages, go on field trips, go online and watch YouTubes. See as many ways as you can expand what you have learned. On our family, we usually take the 4th and the 5th day of every school week to do these expanded projects. Then have them narrate back to you what they've learned and put it on a notebooking page, and then decorate the notebooking page with pictures of everything that they have learned. And this is important. As you finish a book, I keep a list of the books that we've written, and I think it's really valuable for their portfolio. But ask, what was the main idea? What was the main thing that the author of this book was wanting to communicate? If you start asking your kids that from the time they are very small all the way up, then by the time we get to what I'm going to tell you to do in high school, they'll be used to it. They'll be used to constantly thinking, what's the main idea? What's the main idea? What's the main idea? That's really, really important to do. Now, as you get into high school and you're giving them real books, let's say you give them a book from the 1500s, and the way the person speaks is very different from us. Their sentences tend to be quite long, and sometimes because they're old books, the text is all running together on the page. First of all, it's really important that they can read these things because they're gems. They're absolute gems. But you need to start by reading them together so that your children can watch you evaluate. Christine Miller on her website, and I'm going to give you a link to this below, has given a list of ideas. I'm going to summarize them. I think they're fantastic. And then you can go and read her article to get a fuller summary than I can give you in this video. She says to keep a subject notebook. She says to use a spiral notebook. In our family, we've used 3-ring binders because we've found that you can keep adding to it. Either one works. I like a binder with dividers, and then the last tab. Behind that, we keep a bibliography of all of the books that we've read. Now, by a subject notebook, she means have a science one and maybe break it down further into biology, chemistry, and so on. Have a history one, and you may want to break it down further. Art, literature, you can just break it into subjects and have these binders. On the last section, behind that last tab in the bibliography, you're going to write in bibliography format, which you want your kids to learn. You can look at our writing curriculum and find what that is. Put the date that you started each book and the date that you finished it. Those will be fantastic records for making a transcript. Then you're going to read each book twice. First time through that you're going to skim it. You want to take at the most a week at this, and you want to teach your kids to read books quickly. Sometimes people say, Anne, how do you read so fast? I'm not really reading in depth. A lot of the books that I do every day, I'm reading really, really fast. I'm skimming. I'm getting the main idea, and I can get through a lot of books. I can get through more than one book a week. But you want to teach your kids to at least get to that level. As if they're high school students and doing high school level work, you want to teach them to be able to devour a book quickly and to get the basic idea of what it's about. They won't know all the facts, no. They won't have every corner turned down and everything highlighted. No, this is just a quick reading so that they're familiar with a broad range of books and ideas. Have them copy by hand into their notebook the table of contents, and be sure, this is important, be sure that the student in that skimming reads the preface and the introduction and probably the first chapter. Then they can just take off and read as fast as they're interested in. If you don't read the author's introduction, you're not going to know what the author is trying to tell you. As an author myself, I wish people would read the introduction. It's a pet peeve, but it's super important. Teach your kids to read the preface and the introduction, and then write down what is the main idea. What does the author say he or she is trying to tell you in that book? Write that down, okay? Now, on the second reading, we're going to learn to outline, and we go chapter by chapter through this book. And maybe at this point you're writing down what are some quotes that really stand out to you? If I were highlighting in a book that I owned with a highlighter, these would be the things that I marked up. Or in my Kindle, I love Kindle. What questions do I have as I read this? What are some of the vocabulary words that I do not understand? That happens a lot. The older the book is, the vocabulary is different. And maybe it was a common word for them at that time, but we don't have it as common. And those vocabulary words, list them, any of them that you don't understand. And then, are there any sentences or paragraphs that are so long and so confusing that I have no idea what the person said? If you own the book, I would just do all of this in the book. If you have it on a Kindle, I do it all in the Kindle, and I have colors for different things. That's one of the reasons I love Kindles. If not, you have your student copy this onto a piece of notebook paper to put in their notebook. Then go back and define all of those vocabulary words. Then together go through the difficult sentences and try to figure out what they're saying. If you have any arguments with the author, definitely write down your arguments. You can argue with authors. I do it all the time. I argue with myself in some of my older books. I really do. Then, when you're done, put a, before that. Then you're going to outline. And outlining is really important. You're going to teach your student to look for the topic sentence. And then what are some of the supporting ideas? So as you go through the chapter, what are their main points? What are their supporting subheadings? Main point, subheadings, main point. It's easier in newer books because authors tend to put headings and subheadings, but it makes us lazy. You can do this in an old book too. You can think to yourself, this is what I do because I love to publish books and I love to format the text and put fonts and all this stuff, put little call out boxes. I think to myself as I'm reading an old book from say the 15 or 1600s, or even Eusebius and some of the first century authors, some of our Christian fathers, I love to think, how would I format that? What would I put in as a heading? What font would I use? That was a great quote. I would pull that out. And that's how I think very visually, like it would be a book that I wanted to publish. But you can do the same thing. Have your kids even decorate this on a page if they wanted to. But you're basically making an outline. Then, when you're done for that chapter, put a one-sentence thesis, a one-sentence summary of that whole chapter. What was the author saying in that chapter? Put that with a table of contents, and then go on to chapter number 2. By the time you're done, you're going to have a fantastic overview of that book. Your kids will know the material very well, whether you agree with it or not. They'll have argued with it and come up with their own opinions. They could write essays on why they disagree and their supporting statements. Can you see why this is fantastic for your students? I just can't recommend it enough. You could do the same with poetry. Poetry is a little different. I like to do poetry one per week. We have 1 year's worth of that on our website. Someday maybe I can add some more, but you can do it with any poetry. I like to mix poetry with art, and we're going to talk about art again in a second, but to add artwork to poetry, it can be very special to you. Hang it on the wall. Try to make a poem that imitates the style of the one that you're doing. Can you make a poem in a similar style? That helps your kids understand style in poetry and the different forms of poetry that are used. Help your kids learn meter. Meter is the beat. And now see where we're coming into music. So that's why I think literature, art, and music all go together. They're very filled with similar formats, similar ways of organizing material to a climax and then coming back down. Music does the same thing. Art definitely does the same thing. So as you study one, it helps you study other things. Let's talk about music for a second. I don't know if I should do music or art first. I like both of them. I love music. I was a piano teacher for quite a few years back when we were first married. I didn't finish my degree in music. I switched to education and marketing. I switched to 5 different majors before I was all done. But music was one of my first. And then later on, I finished my certification as a piano teacher so that I could teach. And I love it. I absolutely love music. And yet I have 7 children, and not all of them are pianists. Actually, I only have one that is in love with the piano. The rest of them have other instruments and music that they love. And I've noticed that each one of them has developed music as they have grown in their own way, not the way I thought that it would happen. I do think that it is biblical to teach music. I do think it is biblical to use music on the Sabbath day. There are psalms written specifically for the Sabbath, and they talk about using many different kinds of instruments and praising Yehovah with our voice and with instruments. And since the whole thing was written in poetic form, I think that poetry and writing lyrics to songs is also a good way to make a new song to Yehovah. I would suggest that you teach the following 5 categories, and you do it together as much as possible, because music is better together. Teach theory, because theory is how is the music constructed. It's not just naming the notes and knowing what your quarter notes and your half notes are, but it's understanding beyond into the way songs are put together and their chord progressions and why certain songs are put together on this scale and that scale. Scales are very important. You can get some fantastic books, and I've got resources for you below the video. You should teach music history. And you should teach music history, if at all possible, in the same framework of the book of Revelation that we're using for everything else. You've been studying history, with our curriculum, and you understand how that works. So now pull in music history and put it in. Help your kids see the context in which a song was written, especially their classical music. Note reading. Note reading will help your kids later go on to the 4th one, which is composing. And note reading is a valuable skill for their brains, but it's just so practical. If your kids can note read, they can take up a lot of instruments. And finally, singing. Proper singing. My expertise is piano. I do love to sing, but I'm not the most amazing singer that ever happened. But you should, maybe you can involve your kids in singing in parts, harmonies, singing in quartets and small groups, singing in choirs. And those are such amazing opportunities for them. And learning good breath support and all of those things are just really helpful tools for life. If you're going to teach your kids instruments, this is my very non-humble opinion about the instruments that you should teach them. I think the recorder is awesome for just note reading ability alone and just learning the basics of music and how it works. I think drums are awesome. A snare drum. Get a book on snare drums. Get a simple pad at a music store that you can put down, a rubber pad or whatever that you can use at home, and it's not too loud and not too annoying. And get some drumsticks. Spend a couple dollars at a music store for those few things, plus a drum method book, maybe a band method book. And have your kids learn to just concentrate on the rhythm. Just thinking about rhythm for 1 year and be able to read any rhythm without any hesitation with their snare drumsticks is fantastic for them. And they can apply it to any instrument, and they can apply it to singing. I love the piano. I like the piano because it reaches both the right brain and the left brain. I love the piano because it maps it out in this beautiful, very scientific, obviously designed by a creator way of seeing how music goes together. I think you should teach the science behind music while you learn piano. The piano is just a very important skill, and I would recommend teach it as soon as you can, as young as you can, but even 1 year of lessons. And if you can't afford piano lessons, if you're a member of Homeschooling Torah, we give you a free 1 year method for teaching piano. I developed it as a piano teacher, and I know you can teach just that much. No, you're not going to be raising up a concert pianist, but you will be teaching someone at least the basics of piano, and they'll enjoy it. So that's on our website under the music tab under Together School for any of our members. Please feel free to take advantage of that. And finally, if you got all that done, then let them go on to to guitar or ukulele or one of the stringed instruments, because now they're going to be able to think about chords. And and it's a whole new way of thinking, and it's very fun, very popular. They're going to be able to take this, you can't take a piano or even a keyboard with you to Sukkot or to one of the, on a trip very well. It's hard on Sabbath to gather around in a circle outside and take my piano outside. But guitars and ukuleles and stringed instruments, things that are easily able to be carried, flutes, clarinets, all of these small portable instruments, this is the time to start learning those. They usually say that some of those are better learned when the child is reaching the middle ages because they have better breath support, their arms are longer to get around the instrument better. I'm sure there are pros and cons, but I have found that to be very helpful. Finally, let's talk about art, because all of these things that we've been talking about are a way of looking at the world that Yehovah made and taking the gifts and talents that he's giving us and expressing that beauty to others. And that's really important, to start to look at how intricately beautiful Yehovah's world is. What does it sound like? How do other authors describe it? And then let's try to describe it ourselves by painting it, by drawing it, by just, photographing it with a camera. That's art. Making websites. All of these are artistic ways of showing beauty. God is a God of beauty and order. To me, one of the most important ways of teaching art is to teach them to copy. Instead of just throwing a blank piece of paper in front of a child and say, draw me something, it's much better to say, here's a flower, can you draw this flower? Of course they can't draw it very well. Maybe that's a difficult one to start with. The classics start with an apple. That's also very difficult. But copying something that we see, looking at something and observing it with our senses, and then reproducing it as best we are able to. And of course we grow in our ability the more that we do it. I also enjoy teaching art history by getting famous pieces of artwork, reproductions, of course, a book of them, maybe looking at them on the internet, and sitting in front of the screen and try to reproduce it. If you don't have, that kind of watercolor paints or oil paints or, whatever the author or the artist used, then just do it with crayons and colored pencils, or, draw it with a pencil. But it's really helpful. You would learn so much about art just by copying. If you did nothing else for artwork, that would be a fantastic place to start. We do have a small amount of art curriculum on the Homeschooling Torah website, and my daughter is graduated from high school and is studying art, so I'm trying to twist her arm to help me get some more curriculum put in that category this year, so we'll be watching for that. I like to teach calligraphy and good cursive handwriting, making it beautiful. And then that goes into fonts, which our family loves web design, so that's really fun, and desktop publishing. But all of this is artwork. I think the most inexpensive way to start with art is by just drawing with a pencil, getting maybe some charcoal pencils. That adds the price a little bit, getting good erasers. And then watercolor is also an inexpensive way. So I like those two as my favorite for keeping the expenses down. And once you get into oil painting and things, the prices can go really up. Again, teach art history. It goes well with church history. Church history should be learned along with art history, because you'll find that much of the art through the last few thousand years has been closely together with church history. I think that's really interesting, the command to not make a graven image. You're going to have to discuss as a family, what does that mean to you? Are you allowed to do sculpture? Are you allowed to do those kinds of artwork? What has been done through the last 2,000 years? What kinds of things, and even beyond that, back into ancient times, Babylonian history, Persian history, what kinds of artwork did they have? Egyptian history. Again, I consider that church history, religious artwork is what I should say. And study those two together. It's very illuminating, and it helps your kids understand why certain pieces of artwork were made. I think this is also one area. Do not go on the internet studying out YouTubes on how to do different art techniques without first previewing them. I cannot tell you how difficult that has been. We've found really great illustrations of how to do things online, and you watch the whole 12-minute video and you get to minute 11 and nudity is on the screen. So please, please, of all the areas, be sure that you do this with your children and even preview ahead of time. Just a little tidbit there for you. So I think that's everything that I have on my list. I do invite you to join some of the clubs that we're going to be starting in the fall. In September, they are for high school only. I'm sorry. The other kids, please just feel free to share their artwork on our private Facebook group if you're a member of Homeschooling Torah. And that will be as much as we're going to do for the younger kids for the moment. But for our high school students, we do invite them to join our clubs and be able to interact with other teenagers who are trying to apply these exact principles. These are the things that we're going to talk about. And that way they can maybe bounce some of their essays, some of the things that they're learning off of other students their age. And you as parents can be overseeing and discussing it, and you're going to learn just gobs and gobs of things. So thank you for listening. Please put your ideas and comments below the video as well. I'd love to hear your ideas. Shalom.